There are stories that time tries to erase, but heaven insists on keeping alive. Among them is one that speaks directly to the wounded heart, to the man who lost everything and yet never lost his faith. His name has echoed for millennia, Job. But what really happened to Job? Was it just a story about suffering, or is there a secret hidden in the pain, a revelation most people never see? You know the part where he loses his children, his home, his health. But there's something rarely said, something not found in the tragedy, but in what it reveals about God himself. In the beginning, Job lived in fullness, a man of integrity who feared God, surrounded by prosperity. His herds covered the horizon, his lands breathed abundance, and his family reflected divine blessing. Everything seemed untouchable until something happened, unseen. In the heavenly council, the enemy questioned the sincerity of Job's faith. "Does Job fear God for nothing?" asked the accuser, and heaven fell silent. That silence was the prelude to the test. God didn't answer with words, but with permission. And this is one of the hardest truths to accept. Sometimes God tests the very faith he once praised. When the wind blew, it carried away his children. When the fire fell, it burned his crops. When the plagues came, they destroyed his livestock. And finally, Job's body was covered in sores. Everything he had was stripped away, except his faith. And that's where the story turns. Because the book of Job isn't about losing, but about what remains when everything is gone. His friends came, voices of religion trying to explain the unexplainable. They said it was punishment, sin, judgment, but no human explanation can decipher the ways of a God who works in the unseen. And then Job does something that changes everything. He questions God, not in rebellion, but in pain. He doesn't understand, but he doesn't run. And God, instead of punishing him, responds. When everything seemed over, when even Job's voice was lost in the desert wind, something happens. A whirlwind rises on the horizon. It's not destruction, it's revelation. God speaks, but not to explain. He doesn't give the why. He reveals the who. "Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth?" asked God. Job didn't need answers. He needed vision. He needed to understand that the same God who commands the thunder also counts the tears. Job's pain wasn't the end. It was the lens through which he would see God in a way he never had before. He says, "Before I had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." This is the invisible turning point of the story. Job's suffering led him to a place prosperity never could, to an intimate knowledge of God. And there's something profound here. Job wasn't restored after understanding everything. He was restored while worshipping in the middle of his pain. God didn't appear to explain, he appeared to transform. Because the faith that stands when there are no answers is the faith heaven calls gold. When Job bows in silence, heaven begins to move. God commands his friends to ask for forgiveness. Job prays for them, and that changes everything. The man who was wounded becomes an intercessor. The one who was accused becomes a channel of restoration. And in that act of forgiveness, the miracle begins. The text says, "And the Lord restored Job's fortunes when he prayed for his friends." Not when he complained, not when he questioned, but when he prayed for those who hurt him. The scene shifts. Dust rises over the land of Uz. And the man who once sat in ashes now stands before glory. The God who took everything is the same God who gives back double. But the restoration is not just material, it's spiritual. What Job received back wasn't only flocks and children, but a new way of seeing life. He understands that true wealth isn't in what you have, but in what remains when the world collapses. Job realizes that his suffering wasn't punishment, it was an invitation, a call to know a God who cannot be confined to human explanations. God's silence at the beginning now makes sense. It was the silence of someone working in deep places, the silence of one who builds roots before showing fruit. And perhaps that's the hidden lesson in Job's story. Sometimes God doesn't answer because he's teaching you to hear the invisible. Heaven hadn't abandoned him. It was preparing him to see beyond the pain. In the end, Job doesn't just survive, he's transformed. The suffering was the fire, but faith was the gold. And when everything ends, the text closes with a line that seems simple, but carries an eternal promise. And Job died old and full of days. Full, not because he had much, but because he learned to see God in everything. This is the true story of Job, not about loss, but about revelation. And maybe the same voice that spoke in the whirlwind is calling you today, in the middle of your desert, to see what Job saw. A God who is still present, even when everything seems silent. If this message spoke to your heart, don't leave without writing Amen in the comments. And share this video. someone needs to be reminded that God's silence is also an answer.